Hi, my name's Lee Maxey, and welcoming you to another of the Mindmaxing podcast series. And this series is focusing on the journeys that adolescents take to adulthood and how education supports, helps, hinders, and enables that journey. And I'm delighted to be here with Andy Chan from Wake Forest University, who's the VP of Innovation and Career Development. And I got a chance to listen to Andy speak at a New York Times event. I think it was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And gosh, I was just fascinated with the things that he was doing down and his team at Wake Forest were doing to really focus on, okay, it's not just when you're a senior that you need to start thinking about what to do next, but all the way into the recruitment process and the pre-freshman year and freshman year, starting from the very beginning of saying, okay, you're coming to college and we want to make sure you have a successful life, not just while you're here at Wake Forest, but as you go forward. So I was really enthralled by the things that I heard back then and have been following Wake Forest and some of the things that they've been doing. And it seems like it's been very successful. But what we're trying to do here is take a look at that journey that adolescents take, and it's gotten more complicated with both the many pathways that people can take. There's many more choices now, but also in the workforce and the work environment, what the expectations are for graduating students in terms of what kinds of, I'll call it career or many careers that they're likely to have, and how well prepared they are to reach adulthood. And in one of our earlier podcasts, Anthony Carnevale talked about the age that adults become financially independent in 1983 was 25, and today it's around 32. So that adolescence to adulthood, when that adulthood finally happens, is definitely been moving further and further out. So without further ado, Andy, welcome. So glad you could join us, and love to hear your thoughts about what's working right now in terms of how education supports the many pathways that people take.
Lee, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And it's a topic that I think is a really important one for us to be discussing. One of the things that I oftentimes do is spend time talking to parents of high schoolers or college students, even young adults. They're all wondering, how do I help my child navigate from high school to college to career? And one of the things I always start with is just how different it is to imagine being a 20-year-old today in 2022 and being a 20-year-old if you were to go back 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years, go back to 1982 or 1992. And little things, the internet did not exist. Schools and colleges actually didn't have as much resources actually as they do now, whether it be scholarships or just people on campus trying to help students. So a lot of the assumptions that we make about what colleges are like and what they do based on our experiences back in the 80s and 90s, it's very different today. And that students themselves are very different today. And it's just something for us to just keep in mind. So when I think about some of the really great things that I think colleges are doing that give us some hope. So one is that I think that all colleges are looking at how do we better make sure students are well prepared for life after college. Whether they're actually doing it across the board equally is different, but at least in general, I think schools are trying to invest more in this area and be more intentional about it. One of the, I guess, the real dichotomies in colleges is that there are many colleges, and what they've done is develop specific programs that are very vocationally oriented, whether it be business school, engineering school, nursing programs, programs that are really sort of pushing you down a career path early on to actually help you be prepared. In some ways, that's really positive. In some ways, though, it's a challenge because it's hard to ask a 17, 18-year-old when they're in high school to know what they want to do and choose that before they go into college. So that, in a way, is a little bit of a disservice. And one of the pieces of advice I oftentimes give to parents is, to the extent you can have your high school student go and meet people who are using engineering in their careers, meet people who actually are nurses or are doctors, students can actually start to get some information that makes them really either get more excited to go down that path and do the work required, or realize, oh, this isn't exactly it. So that's sort of one dynamic that around universities and colleges that I think have to be thought through is we are in some ways getting more vocationally and skill driven in some places, and other places, traditional liberal arts schools or more things in the arts and humanities oftentimes are seen as very difficult to navigate from college to career. Schools do need to do a better job to actually help students understand, if I major in one of the things that are in the arts or humanities, how do I also become very employable? That's obviously something we worked on heavily at Wake Forest, but I do think universities are trying. And I do think that, in fact, this moment of COVID, post-COVID, is forcing universities to think more creatively about how to address that particular issue and even look to sort of technology-based solutions to help with that. So I'll say that's sort of one thing. Second thing that actually is starting to occur, it's just the beginning of it, and this is one that a lot of people wouldn't know, is that whether it's at colleges and universities or whether it's actually at third-party organizations, and you and I actually know a lot about this area around the idea of helping students, whether it be in college age or adults, get certificates and skills in ways that are not about having to learn it necessarily in a traditional classroom. You can actually do it in online forms. So in fact, I was just talking to a young alum who, her first job, she ended up working in sort of the financial industry, but doing more like marketing and PR, where there's a lot of writing, but her background and her interests are more in analytics. But in order to be able to get the kind of analytical jobs that she wants, she's going to have to probably get some kind of more education, including learning about Tableau or R or Python or SQL, which all sound like foreign languages, but they're all actually technical skills that she could either go to a expensive master's program, she could go to a certificate program that's a lot less expensive, she could actually even do it for free on Coursera just to find out whether or not she wants it. These are things that are creating opportunities for students that people did not know existed before. So where it felt like before, if you didn't choose the right major in college, like all of a sudden, like all doors start to shut, I've got to go to grad school. Now grad school is one option, but there are a lot of other things that you can do there too. And I think even universities are developing schools of professional and continuing studies that are making that available. So whether it's the colleges do it or whether it's the pressure from third parties who are outside of the college system who are doing it, I think that's actually a huge positive trend actually for education in general, although it creates pressure on the traditional models. I think the one last thing that I will mention that I do feel like that many schools are beginning to do, but still have a ways to go, is that I think many schools are starting to realize that this gap between what they're teaching in the classroom and what employers are looking for students when they go to work, there is a gap. And it's both the translation of what are the things I'm doing in the classroom and what are the words that I use to describe that and how does that translate to what's actually out of the classroom. But also all schools are starting to think, well, maybe actually we have to help students have co-curricular, extracurricular, internship for credit type experiences that help them take what they're learning in the classroom and apply it in some way. I mean, literally could be apply what I'm learning in an anthropology class about culture and then go work in a nonprofit where you're actually looking about how that nonprofit affects the culture of that community and you write a paper about that. Like that's something where it seems like those connections seem sort of natural, but historically that wasn't the case. It was a bit, we have work in the classroom, you learn it theoretically, and you'll figure out the rest of it on your own. I think schools are starting to realize we need to be more intentional about making that happen. Schools who are actually on the far end of really doing it are schools that have co-ops like Northeastern, University of Cincinnati, where it's like part of their culture, which is we're going to have students get experience while they're here, learning both the academic and getting the work experience. I think more schools are starting to think like that, and I think that's a positive trend that I'm hoping will continue to be more of in the future.
It's funny because Northeastern was working so hard to shed that image 20 years ago to try and join I'll call it the big boys, and yet their DNA, where they came from, I believe, I agree with you 100%, is very applicable to what's needed now. Our daughter goes to a very good school that Wake Forest beats in football and basketball regularly, and I saw exactly what you're describing, where she was channeled into a major, very confusing because there's so many choices, and needing to make that decision as a freshman, changed her mind. didn't have enough credits for this new thing that she was doing. And the only career preparation that I'm aware of from the school is a letter that they sent to the parents. She's graduating this spring, saying, yeah, it's really hard to get a job in this major.
Oh no.
I'm like, okay. Wow, that's the white flag if I've ever seen it.
Yes.
But eventually it'll turn out. And Anthony Carnevale's work with the CEW has that whole ROI database, which shows majors and colleges and what the ROIs are and so forth. And that's not why we sent or want to send our kids to school, although that is I know from the data it's a predictor of success is a college degree. I mean, there's no question about it, but it isn't a straight line. And so I know you've been very purposeful and thoughtful and what I'd call rational and left brain in your approach to try and, streamline these pathways. But given that when they're released into the wild of the workforce, it's not a straight line anymore. I couldn't have pointed to where I am today from 25 years old. There's no way I could have pointed a path to where I am today. So what are your thoughts about, I'll call it the purposeful preparation that I know you are all doing, and I'll call it the broad-based or the resilience or agility required to be able to adjust once they, Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, but until that happens for them.
Very good question. And so, one of the things that I think is, again, a very interesting dynamic is the difference between what it means to be a student in 2022 and being maybe us when we were a student in the mid 80s or something like that, or, early 90s. And I think that one of the biggest ones is that for whatever reason, this internet social media thing has created a weird dynamic where, in fact, in some ways you would say, wow, there's so many options of what I could do. That should give me hope. And then what happens on the other end is it looks like that person's happy and that person's happy and they look like they know what they want and I don't. So I must be really super lost or something's wrong with me. And so that is a dynamic that is just a super hard challenge to wrestle with around just the mindset of how to think about like what you described, which is the future is uncertain, but I'll find my way and it'll be okay. And for some reason right now, a lot of young people are like, if I don't make the perfect decision right now, and that will lead to another bad decision, if I don't have the perfect first job right now, that's going to mean I'm going to be poor for the rest of my life. Like, it's amazing how dramatic the potential outcomes of what could happen when there's so much life left to live. And so I do feel like there's this one dynamic where we, as a boomer or, just post boomer, Gen Xer, I guess the main thing is that what can happen is we seem to be in a place where oftentimes we grew up in a world where our parents were not that influential on us. We actually had a lot of independence and we had to figure out on our own. For some reason in this world right now, parents are like on top of their kids for every little thing. And eventually they're almost too worried about their kids, not letting their kids see that there's room for chances that maybe you can learn and grow. So that being said, I do think I oftentimes encourage parents to talk to their kids about the challenges that they had to actually figure out what they were going to do and that it's okay for their kids to actually have that same process. Hopefully they feel that way, but I'm hoping that they could actually realize that it is okay. One. Two is this whole idea of how do you actually turn education into be like a desire to always want to learn and grow over your lifetime. So that then what happens is that you don't believe that because I made it up, my daughter studies psychology in college, because I study psychology, I have to do anything that's in the psychology bandwidth and I can't do anything outside of it. Thankfully, my daughter is like looking at it and happens to have a boyfriend who's doing data analytics. And she's like, I sort of like what he's doing. I think I'm going to learn that stuff. And she's actually got an attitude of, I don't care what anyone tells me that I can't learn data analytics. I'm a smart young person. Why don't I give it a try? So I do think if we can be more encouraging to all of our young people that they can learn a lot of things really quickly if they want to. They may not know if they want to, but in a lot of ways, it's like, give it a try and you'll learn as you go. Like I use this phrase, it's not follow your passions, it's actually follow your interests to discover your passions. Because what happens is if you're interested in something, you have to get into it and get close to it before you can make that decision. Am I passionate about it? But if you never get close enough to it, you'll probably just sort of stay on the sidelines and not do anything. And that's what happens a lot of times. People will say, well, until I really figure out what I want to do, then I'll start going after it. Well, you'll do a lot of standing around just wondering what that thing will be because you never got close enough to it. So this is the interesting balance, is that I think we have to recognize that there is a role that schools should play to introduce students into these processes and these mindsets as part of the experience of getting the benefit of the education you're getting. The challenge, I do think, is that depending on the student, depending on the school, what can happen is it can feel a little bit like I have to have it all figured out from the beginning, or I don't have enough people around me who are giving me some guidance that is a little bit more perspective oriented, like the things that we're talking about right now. So it does put a bit of a burden back on the parent, if the parent's willing to actually have these kinds of conversations with their child in some way, shape, or form. Or I use this phrase, connect them with other wise adults with perspective, who they might say the same thing you would say, but they're more likely to hear that wise adult because the other person's actually not you. You know, the parent, sometimes they don't want to hear from, but they might listen to their uncle, they might listen to your friend who actually runs a, you know, as, I don't know, a consultant, or, you know, as a doctor or whatever, but they may start to realize, wow, actually I can get a lot of information and help from other kind, friendly adults if we can play that connector role. And I know that, again, is hard for a lot of young people to do, but I do think anything we can do to help students get comfortable with that without them expecting them to have to do it totally, completely on their own. That is one thing I think more than anything we've come to learn, is that if we say the word network to most young people, they will just turn their eye and say, I don't want to hear that word. That word is like it's one of the worst words I want to hear, because it sounds like I have to sell myself or ask for something from someone that they don't want to give to me. Like I'm not wired that way. And so what I try to tell people is, have you learned how to do research pretty well in college? Yes. Have you learned how to gather information? Yes. Have you learned how to ask good questions? Yes. Well, actually do those things, gather a process of gathering information from just one person. And I will introduce you to a friendly person. You just go have a conversation and let's see where it leads. And what can happen is the students start to realize, wow, that person was way more helpful than I thought. Maybe that'll lead them to the next person, to the next person. And I think it's through actually those conversations that they start to realize, okay, this doesn't have to be as linear as I thought, or there are ways to actually move from place to place because I'm meeting all these people who that's what they've done too. And so I do think, I mean, that's another thing I tell people is really interesting, is because of things like LinkedIn, there's more information on people that, you know, we never had when we grew up. And so if you just spend a little time in LinkedIn looking at what these people's backgrounds are, you start to go, that's pretty interesting. Like, these people have really windy careers, and I don't know how they ended up from place to place, but maybe I actually could learn about that. And that might be sort of how my story might unfold too. So I think it is a bit about normalizing the fact that no one really has it all figured out and no one really knows exactly what they're doing. And that it's always a process of constant learning and gathering of information so that you can sort of see, okay, what's the next step that might open up another door along the way.
Well, I have several friends, and we use the example of Hitchcock's movie Strangers on a Train, but in a positive sense, to do what you talked about, which is we've agreed to be there for each other's kids. Like, I'll take your kid, you take my kid, and you be the voice that they listen to, which I think I have found personally that's, you know, super effective. But I agree with you on that networking comment, and we've, you know, the advent of social media, you know, and what networking has, you know, been, you know, impacted by technology. There's still the human element of networking, and you know, one of the things I've talked about with our kids is, you know, when you do either, or they get help, but they're not going to leave, you know, and 3 days later say, oh yeah, I know, I could go help that kid I talked to, you know, 3 days ago. That's not how it works. It's in the moment. Do they have something that's top of mind that can actually, like you said, move them to the next person, to the next person, to the next person? So
I want to add on to that. You know, both you and I are both marketing oriented people, and so one of the things that I think is useful for people who, you know, have children who are adolescents moving through the process is to be okay with saying, why don't we just like role play? You're having a conversation with me, I'm the contact. Let's just begin that conversation. And allow sort of have a pretend conversation, and then just to say, obviously, like in any feedback, start with, hey, here's some of the positive things that I really saw in our conversation, and here's some things that I could see that you might want to consider. So you're not actually criticizing, you're not saying do it this way, so you might want to consider. And it may be as simple as eye contact, or it may be as simple as be clear about what it is that you really are asking for. Make it a 1-question question, not a 5-question question. Or in the beginning, it's always showing interest in their person. I'm really interested in learning about your background, and what do you do today, and how did you get there? What was your pathway from college or high school all the way to this type of role? I think that is also a nice way to help them realize a lot of this conversation is about just getting to know each other, and then getting to know more about maybe the company or the work that they do. And then finally is, do you have any advice for me? A lot of times when students are looking for a job, they think, if I just tell them I'm looking for a job, can you help me? That'll be clear. But you and I know that, well, that's actually a closed-ended question. If the answer is no, there will be no conversation.
Right.
So you're trying to do everything to not get to the close. You're close answered no. You're actually trying to just keep everything open, so that they might say, I want to just keep talking to you. I want to learn about you. I want to learn from you. And that maybe you have some ideas on advice, how you can be helpful. As you and I know, like when people ask really good questions, you want to help them because they seem like they're a person you can then introduce to someone else, because they're going to ask really good questions, and they're not coming across as a person who is either entitled or they're just desperate to get something, and so they just want me to help them close the deal. So getting uncomfortable with a conversation, and being comfortable with the uncertainty of knowing what the outcome will be at the end of it, is something we all have to get used to.
I believe that's one of the things, you talked about doing research, and I don't know if people are really educated to ask good questions. I think the essence of relationships is, a combination of listening deeply with your heart, really listening to the other person, and also, like you said, asking questions that demonstrate that you're interested. And you can learn from that. And the open-ended questions, we talk about it at MindMax a lot, the importance of asking open-ended questions. There's a pregnancy of, okay, well, there's always something there in an open-ended question. Whereas, like you said, can you help? No, that's the easiest answer. And people tend to take the easiest pathway. But so as you take a look at, from your standpoint, because I know you look, I'll call it backwards down into the, secondary education, you look forwards into the employer market. What are some barriers or obstacles where, I'll use the judgment of siloed educational transitions and things like that. What are some barriers that are really making it harder for people to go on their journey, or making the pathways, more limited?
Very interesting question, and one that's sort of, I'm trying to think through like how different it is at this moment compared to maybe what it was like before. What does come to mind though is that we've built a system by which it has seemed like having tests like the SAT and the ACT are very, very important to be successful to get into then the college process. So I do feel like that's one where I was actually somewhat hopeful that when COVID, all the schools went test optional, that they were going to sort of stay there. And it feels like that sort of, some are staying there, some are reversing. It's actually making it very confusing. But that is one example that I do think that rather than trying to help students become just learners and communicators, they're actually still, I want to be, I guess, learn and everything, but all for the nature of, I got to ace the test. So I do feel like that's one dynamic that it does create some impediments, especially as we all know for students from under-resourced backgrounds. They just don't have the resources and the experiences that we can give to students who actually can get people to help them with tests or tutors or all the like. So I do think that's sort of one dynamic. The second dynamic actually is and I think about this a lot, is sort of this assumption that the most highly ranked schools are the best schools, and that the schools that are most selective and the hardest to get into are the best schools. And so if I get into them, they must be the best, so I got to go to them. And I think we all know at some level that the best school is the one that actually is best fit for you. It's not actually about whether they're selective or not, or what they're ranked. In fact, if you really look at all these rankings, many of them, the criteria are just very arbitrary by the team of people who created the rankings, of which they're not actually things that always the students really value. They could be things like how many tenured faculty members are there? Well, does that matter to actually the student? Maybe, maybe not. How much money do you spend on research? Does that match to the undergrad student? Maybe, maybe not. They might be asking like, is the university's strength, that's a different question than the experience of an undergraduate student and the outcomes they have and the culture that's there. Like those are not really embedded in a lot of these rankings. And so this is another, again, systemic thing that we've bought into over time that has created weird perceptions. Another one that might be related to that is how good is their football team? So if you actually have a really great football team and you spend a lot of money to have a great football team and a great football coach and you win a lot, so therefore you must have a great school. I'm not really sure anyone ever thought that was correlated, but that's another thing that can happen too. So I think that's another thing. I will go even further than we tend to, as parents, think that there's certain good majors and certain not so good majors, and what we actually don't even know is that there probably, I don't even know, I've so much to do the analysis, but I bet there are 5 to 10 times more majors that exist today in terms of variety than existed in college campuses 30, 40 years ago. That there's just so many different like niche specialties that people have created. So that's both good and bad, right? The good is that maybe actually there are things that really are needed and the world wants and the students are valuing and the employers want. And maybe there's some that maybe don't make sense, but we can't really judge, but we end up having this perception that we know a lot about like majors and where they go based on what we knew when we were in school or what our assumptions are about them. When in fact, I say this a lot of times, I can't speak to the value of the liberal arts in general for every school across the country and in the United States, but I can speak to about the value of the liberal arts at Wake Forest. Every school is going to have their own different way that they're actually like making it work or not work, but that's something which makes it hard for the consumer, but you have to not treat every school like they're exactly the same. It can be very different. In fact, one of the things that I oftentimes, when I talk to students who are thinking about going to college, I said, do you really think you might know what you want to study? Let's say they really want to study classics. That's cool. You want to study classics. So do you know like the top ranked classics sort of departments in the country? You can find it. Well, I never thought about that. I thought I'd just go to the like best university. It's like, well, actually the best classic departments could be at schools you don't even know of, because it's those faculty in the classics and the way they teach and the way they're recognized in the world that might be perfect for you. So you might end up going to a school where no one knows about it, but the reason why you went is because you love classics. So there's all these sort of underneath things depending on like where you are. You could be a student who's like, I don't know what I want to explore. Then it's really important for you to go to school where you say, how good are you at helping me figure out what I want to major in? If I change my mind, will you actually help me? Is that easy to do or really hard? Do I have to take another year or two of school if I'm going to change my mind? Like those are good things to know before you get into it, but it's very difficult because, when you have this dynamic where the parents might be thinking at one level, the students are thinking at one level, and then the students are, not able to sort of really know what are the questions I'm supposed to ask here. So that is another thing about the process that I think is very difficult. So then this last step, which would be, okay, now we're going from college to career. And one of the biggest pieces that I feel like I wish could be done, which you referred to right from the intro, is why don't we have some kind of formal course or requirement where students are thinking from the very beginning, why am I coming to college and where does getting a job fit into all this? And what are the different ways I could think about that, of which, even if I'm thinking about grad school, where does that fit into this? And when do I start thinking about these different things? It would be really helpful, even though it feels like, well, that's a lot to put on a student when they're a freshman, when they come in. It's like, well, then unpack it over the entire year, like do a little bit every other week where they're actually doing an asynchronous video where they're actually having to do it. And if you don't get it done, you don't get to go to sophomore year. Well, okay, then I'll do this video and I'll actually have to take these little quizzes to make sure like I know why I'm here and I'm thinking through like, when do I have to start working on my resume or getting an internship or things like that. And the fact that, as you and I know, the more internships you get, the more likely you're going to actually have clarity about what you want to do for work and the more likely you're going to get a job. But if we don't actually make that clear to students, they don't know. And the number of times, as you've heard, like in my career services semester I talk, that alumni come back and go, if I only knew as much as I do now that I'm a senior, I've graduated, back when I started, I would have actually been way better off through the whole process. But we never talk about it. And so I just feel like that's the kind of thing where, for whatever reason, a few institutions have done it, a lot do it if you have more vocationally oriented ones, because you're on a path. but it's almost it's the students who don't have a path that need it the most because they don't know exactly what they're supposed to be thinking and doing. And this is another thing we found, is that for students who actually have some kind of curriculum, they tend to be more confident, less stressed, they do better in the classroom, they're clear about what they want to study, they actually are more motivated to get jobs. Like, everything is all positive. There's nothing that's really negative. I know that sometimes some students could say, I'm a little more stressed because I actually have to think about this. But what we say to them is, imagine the stress you would be in if you didn't have any of this information in your senior year trying to figure out how to get a job. And that's when those seniors who haven't done it, they're like, yeah, this is not worth that. This stress that I have about trying to find something when I haven't thought about it for 4 years, that's not a great situation to be in. So I do think those are all dynamics at play. The last big one, I think, is just employers, because of the world and how fast it's changing. We experience it, whether it's a virtual hybrid work world, whether it's dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, whether it's just the rapid pace of change and the globalization of the world. Like, these are all pressures that the employers are wanting to say, students, are you ready for this world you're about to come into? Because we want to hire you and we want you to stick around, and we want to actually, make this worth our while to be in work together. And I do think that that's one of those things where, again, I think employers would say, can you do a little bit more in the college world to actually help them be more prepared? I do think actually having more work related experiences would really help them.
Even informational interviews, even that is a sort of a cursory scan or a primer to like you said. I love that quote, which is, I wrote that down: follow your interest to discover your passions. I think that's brilliant. My dad said something similar to me, which is, do something when you get out of college. At least you'll know one thing you don't want to do. But it was a little bit more of a stick kind of approach. But I think one of the challenges is, and I don't know if colleges in general or specifically are able to provide that range of personalization. You have some people that are coming in that I used to interview 350 incoming freshmen when I worked in a assistant director of admissions a year. And I'd say 90% of them, I would have beated them as they don't know what they want to do.
Right.
Now, there were a few that were, I'm going pre-med and I want to do this, or I want to be an engineer. Those were two that might have mapped. But given that people don't know, that expectation of needing to know. I took an aptitude test at whatever, 7th or 8th grade, and I was supposed to be a lawyer, and I only knew doctors and lawyers as, like, I didn't even know what to say as a profession. And it's like, okay, that sounds okay. And then I mean, that's not who I am, and that's not of interest to me. But giving people that ability to try things out and fail, I believe that's really important. One of the things I think is a big gift of I'll call it the college experience, is that safety to fail with low consequence or lower consequences. But with what you were saying earlier about the social media and the comparative nature of things, I think we've really created a real pressure cooker that doesn't give, I used to coach soccer. And, I would say the same thing to every kid that came up to me and said, Coach, what do I got to do to be a starter next year? Work on your left foot. Like, that is the guaranteed way to get the biggest return. Most people are right-footed, and that's their dominant foot. Work on your opposite foot, because you're going to get a much greater return for doing that. But if you're in the middle of a game, you're not going to choose your left foot. You're going to do everything with your right foot. And what happened in the youth sports is kids were playing they were playing 3 games a week. So there was no time to just screw around on the playground, and just try things. And I think creating those spaces for discovery or exploration or failure with low consequence, whether it's a maker space, whether it's, like you're saying, so, something along those lines that gives you an ability to fail with relatively low consequence, meaning maybe it's a peer review or something along those lines. I just think that's really important, because if you're always in the game, there's a lot of pressure to use your right foot only.
Yeah, I definitely hear that.
Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts in terms of what could be done, or what do you see happening going forward in terms of, I believe we have a significant mental health challenge for the world with this PTSD after, this pandemic. For some people,
Mhm,
significant; for some people, not as significant. Minimally fatigue for
mhm,
everybody. Um, but I think this preceded the pandemic, which is, the amount of structure that existed in high school and pre-high school, the amount of
mhm,
the lack of structure that happens in college, and then the incredible, job pathway being, a gig economy potentially, or 2 years in a job before you get your next job, or 5 to 7 careers, or whatever stat you want to go with.
mhm,
It's less defined than it's ever been in terms of, what you're going to be when you grow up.
mhm.
So what are some of your thoughts about, what you see coming, and how that might play out?
Wow, there's a lot in that particular question that you're asking me. And so one of the things that I do really think a lot about is this idea of how do we help our young people both understand and strive for holistic health. When people think about it, we used to use the phrase, sort of mind, body, spirit, like how are we doing on all those different dimensions?
Mhm, mhm.
And I think we sort of take for granted, well, I'm in school, I'm taking tests, so intellectually I'm stimulated. And then body, well, I exercise or maybe I don't. And that's actually a really good question. Like maybe I'm not taking that great care of my body. And then there is spirit, like, does that even matter these days? So I do think that these are dimensions that at some level everyone should be paying attention to. But I'm very hopeful that a lot of schools are trying to figure out how to prioritize well-being. There's obviously the what do you do in reaction to the situation and what can you do sort of preventative. And the things that are preventative tend to be sort of culture oriented and obviously program oriented. And then the things that are on the reactive end and sort of healing end might be more like, oh, here's how we'll help you if you actually have
Services.
challenges.
Yep.
And you need both of
Yep.
those things.
Mhm.
I do think a lot of schools are really struggling with this because the volume of need by students for a lot of things is pretty high. And as we know, just during this in this economy right now, a lot of people who do this type of work, who are therapists or counselors and the like, they're pretty burned out too. It's like what we're finding at the hospitals, and so we're all having to figure out like, hopefully, this is just a blip in time and things will start to normalize again. But I do think that one is that in general, to the extent that we as adults and parents in this community who actually care about young people, there's obviously our own family, and then there's people in our local community. Like, what role are we playing that's actually helping to contribute to more of a holistically healthy, positive state versus we're not? There's actually ourselves. If actually we're not doing so good with ourselves, and that's the example that people see around us,
Mhm.
that's not a great example for people, young people, to learn like this is the way how to live. So I do think that's one dynamic. And the other is then how might we begin to think about the conversations we're having with our own young people, our children, people we're mentoring about this idea? Because actually, if we only focus our conversations on get a job, make more money, get a job, get a promotion, it's only the professional, then actually that in itself is a little bit of a default to, yeah, we don't really care about your holistic health, or we're actually not even going to talk about it, even though I think I care about it, but I'm not going to talk about it because maybe I'm uncomfortable or maybe I shouldn't. But the reality is, in some ways, we actually have to put that up in the same conversation, and it's like, hey, let's talk about how things are going. Let's talk first about maybe how you're doing holistically, and then let's talk about your job and work and how we can help you find where you want to go and make those decisions too. So we are very sensitive to those things. I think part of being at Wake Forest and educating the whole person sort of type of motto is one where we try to see what could we do differently in that space. And what are we doing actually even in our career office when we approach students, that we're doing it in a way that helps them know that, their total well-being is more important than actually work on getting a job if they're not in a place to be thinking about getting a job. Like, we can't get students to be working on those types of things if they're under an immense amount of stress, or if they have challenges at home or with a significant other, or whatever it might be academically, like we got to help them get through those foundational things, just like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we can start working on it. Let's help you get this amazing job. Like maybe that's not yet ready. And that's another thing that I also think that you sort of referred to earlier, is that sometimes we actually are all thinking that, oh, these 4 years are like the big 4 years. And, if you're not doing this in this year, you're going to be behind. And then students start to think they're behind, and then they start comparing against everyone who's their peers. But I mean, we all know what's the phrase? Comparison is the thief of all joy. And we actually want to try to help our young people not compare to everyone else. And we want to say, you're on your own path. And you never know when actually that inflection point is going to hit, where all of a sudden you just rocketed past everyone else. It could have happened at 18 or 28 or 38 or 48. Like, you just don't know. But you're hoping that, that you're helping the student be thoughtful about learning about themselves well enough to know, I'm starting to figure out where I'm supposed to be. I'm starting to actually see some difference. And it might be something that's totally different than anything you ever expected for them, because they're growing and changing and learning. And I mean, we talk about this too, is that, students, when they're in the 18 to 21 years age, what do they say? Their soft frontal lobe is still like developing. It's not like they actually have got it all figured out. And it gives us some grace for them to go, hey, this is a time to figure out, back to making mistakes. Don't make a fatal mistake, but yeah, it's okay to try something and figure out you don't like it, or maybe that didn't work out the way you wanted, but now it helps you figure out what direction you want to go. So it's a lot about having sort of less judgment, less comparison, and thinking through on our own ourselves, like how much are we being good models for living holistically healthy lives, because we were trying to help our young people figure out how to do the same. It is really hard because you and I know the world's more complicated today than it was 30 years ago. And I have a feeling it's going to be more complicated 20 or 30 years, 30 years from now. We need to do our part to try to help our young people be like developing habits today that help them be prepared for those kinds of, like, whatever that craziness in the world will be then. They need to hopefully be in a place where they can do so to be effective in the world, and hopefully be leaders that makes great change happen in the world for us too.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I think one of the things that I've taken away from, I'll call it the stressful 2 years of pandemic, is just an increased compassion. I can't go to someone and say, oh my God, you wouldn't believe it, I've been locked up in my house for a year. Like, I'm exhausted. You can't understand them. Like, well, actually, yeah, everyone can.
Yep.
And so I'm hoping the commonality of some of this, global experience that we've just had increases compassion. And I just find that that's a much easier way for people to get along, to network, to even do self-care, and to find their way than being self-critical. Like you're saying, that comparison is the thief of joy.
Thief, yeah, the comparison is the thief of all joy.
Thief of all joy. I love that. That's that should be Facebook's tagline.
That would be a good one.
It would really confuse people. So any closing thoughts that you'd like to have in terms of closing thoughts about encouragement for parents, adolescents, as they go forward?
Well, first, it's been really enjoyable to have this discussion with you, Lee. It's just really fun to be knowing that you are thinking about the pathway from high school to college to career, and also trying to think about it in as holistic way as possible, recognizing the challenges that are obviously in the world, but also that our young people are facing. I'm hopeful that the listeners out there will be thinking, what can I do a little differently that will help a young person, whether it be my young person or a bunch of young people around me, sort of think about how to live and navigate in a way that can benefit from my experiences and my failures and things that I've learned, especially during COVID, about being more compassionate, and not only with others, but even with ourselves, right? I think that we're always caught up with this idea that, there's not a lot of time on the clock. We better get it all done. We got to get it done sooner. We want to be millionaires by 30 and all that other kind of stuff. And that the reality is that, whenever I think about David Brooks, his work around character, and whenever he asks people, like, at the end of a life, most people are mostly thinking about, how do all the people who I lived with, worked with, that I loved, who loved me, like, how do they feel about me? How did I show up? It wasn't about whether I made X amount of dollars, or it wasn't about how many companies I started. It was I a good person? Was I a person who can be helpful to others? And a part of that has to start with, how can we be good to ourselves? And I do think that that's one of the biggest challenges right now, um, in this educational world, is that sometimes we're looking to the educational institution to answer all those questions. And in some ways, the educational institution has to do their part. But I do think that we as parents have to do our part, and actually we as employers also have a part to do in this too. And so, all of us, I think, all have to sort of keep in mind that sometimes we think, if only the colleges could get the students better prepared, the students would be fine. And then if only the employers could actually, do this, everything will be fine. It's like everyone's got to do their part.
Be
And so
clear
I'm
about what
hoping
their
that
needs
these
are,
kinds of conversations.
and signal back to the school that this is what we need. Yeah, if only,
Yeah.
Well,
It's almost like, what can we all do? So
yeah. Well, thank you. And this has been another of Mindmaxing's podcast series, and with Andy Chan. And thank you very much, Andy, and wishing you the very best in this hopefully post-pandemic year. So thank you very much.
thank you. We appreciate the time.